DMA Vox Populi, where underrepresented voices have a chance to be heard. Episode 1, A Fight Worth Fighting, Free the App Stores.
It feels like the DMA has given us a voice in a new way that we didn't have before, because the DMA is a regulatory process which requires public input. It's really not hard to submit input, and it does seem to influence things.
Have a clear-cut set of rules, have a clear-cut red lines that cannot be crossed. And those can be, simple. It'd be sort of like a bill of rights for developers, consumers.
That's Hans-Christoph Steiner of F-Droid and Marc Prud'hommeaux of the App Fair project. They are independent technologists fighting for their rights as software developers and for ours as users and consumers. The arena for that fight is app distribution, now in the European Union, shaped by the Digital Markets Act, a landmark regulatory regime that aims to make our digital economic spaces more open and fairer. Among the obligations that apply to Google and Apple as designated gatekeepers under the Digital Markets Act is the obligation to allow for alternative app stores to Android's Google Play and Apple's App Store. We speak with them in particular about how enforcement of this specific DMA obligation is unfolding from their perspective as non-commercial alternative app stores. And as we will see, it's an uphill struggle. Powerful incumbents like Apple and Google do not simply comply with legal obligations. They resist and they fight. Because what is at stake is not only vast sums of money, but the continued exercise of their gatekeeping power, precisely what the DMA aims to dismantle. Can you please give us a quick refresh on what free and open source software actually means and why you as a developer care so much about it?
Open source software philosophically goes back to this idea by Ullman back in the 1980s about free software respecting four fundamental freedoms: freedom to read the source code of the freedom to make changes, the freedom to distribute the original, and also the freedom to redistribute any changes that you make. General idea is that computer is a tool, and the tool really does one thing: it runs software. So if you own the tool, you should also have the means to control the software being run on it. And so free software is kind of the philosophical half, and open source software is kind of the mechanical half, whereby when you are providing a piece of software, either, for desktop computer or for your mobile phone or for some giant server that's running a web server, that code is available for anyone to inspect and anyone to modify and anyone to make their own derived version.
I highly recommend anyone interested in to read the writings of the Free Software Foundation about the four freedoms. If you don't have the technical skills, you still have all the source code. You can hire someone. You can find anyone who has the skills to hire them or get them to help you. So really, these freedoms apply to anyone who uses it, even if they lack the technical skills. This also applies just as much to governments. When our governments use software, they're the user and they want these freedoms. To me, when I hear the term digital sovereignty, is just a translation of the core idea in the terms that current governments want to talk about it. I don't see it any different.
If I've only ever used the official App Store on my Android device, Google Play, what's the first thing about F-Droid that makes me think, oh, I didn't realize app distribution could work like this?
The key difference between F-Droid and other app stores is that we represent users, and when we are reviewing apps and including apps, we take the user's point of view about what people want to accept, and we try to make it as trustworthy as possible from the user's point of view. Anything that is not directly in the user interest, but the user might allow, something like advertising, we will allow users to decide whether they want to see apps that include advertising or things like this, or whether they want to have them completely hidden. We're also ensuring the apps are what they say they are. So from the beginning, we have done review. This is different than, say, Google Play, which has only in the last few years added review. And the one key is that only allow free and open source software. So that means we can have a much more accurate review because we have the complete source code and we see all the details of what an app is doing. Computing devices, laptops, phones, things like this, there's a lot of power, but they also have the possibility to give someone else power over us. And so we are focused on giving the user full control over the computing devices they use. In our case, we focus on mobile devices, so tablets, things like this on Android. Many people believe that this is the way to do it and devote their life and their technical skills to making this possible. It also happens to be more fun working on a project like this, because you see a lot of people who are full-time programmers will contribute in after hours on the side. Because for a lot of programmers, creating software is a creative act, a work of art in a sense. And programmers want to make something beautiful. And with volunteer free software work, you can focus on what you think is beautiful and without someone telling you, no, the deadline is here.
How does the 30% commission developers have to pay to Google and Apple rewire their incentives? When does monetize the user via ads and data brokerage start looking, well, rational?
A lot of people talk about, the 30%, they call it Apple tax, the Google tax. And, this history going back to, game consoles, that was kind of the de facto percentage they charged to get the distribution of applications on platforms, Nintendo and Xbox. And it's sort of the precedent that led to the phone developers being able to say, that for the games industry, so it can work for all software, for everyone, for the millions of people that use these applications. A large cut, a really percentage of revenue. And there are ways to sort of negotiate that down and apply to special programs and things like that. But generally speaking, if you're a significant sized business, you're going to be paying 30% of your revenues. Makes a number of business models, for example, electronic books, simply impossible to paying 30% fee and maintain any sort of profitable margins, which are the reasons why you don't see any electronic book readers on, app devices other than books that will buying assets from inside the application. So question, how has this affected the place? How has this affected the way that people monetize and profit from their applications? And this is something that I actually talked about just a couple of weeks ago at 2026, talk called Loathing in the App Stores. And I think one of the unintended consequences is that the technology makers start seeking profits in ways that are not taxable by, the big tech app stores, by Apple and Google. They, advertisements, everyone knows how that works, right? An advertisement with a tiny little gray box is impossible to tap on. But more sort of insidious is that the technology, the ad tech technology that you wind up using is also tracking you. It's building a profile on you. It's, sending as much information as it can get its hands on to the provider of this ad tech, which then repackages it and sells it on to data brokers. A more sensitive area, because unlike, say, a web browser on your desktop, which has somewhat limited information, so many of these applications have your live location, where you're going, your history, your contacts, your calendar, your photos. They will exfiltrate basically anything they can get their hands on. Against the rules of app stores to do this, they maintain that privilege for their own ad networks that they're running, but it's not enforced. Not enforced because it can't be enforced, because if you don't have any guarantee of the software being free and open source and being able to be inspected by, individual user or the general public, then it's essentially impossible to identify when this is happening.
As a user, if I download, for instance, a task manager from F-Droid, why can I trust that it's not quietly reporting back on me?
We start with the idea that there should be as little trust in the system as required. You should be able to check for yourself as much as possible. And if you don't like what we're doing, be able to take over. So that's the first part. We design as much as possible our own systems so that anyone could take a copy of everything that we have and do it differently. That said, we do work very hard to run a trustworthy app store. There is a hard requirement of free and open source software. That means all of the software that we build, we can inspect in detail. Anyone can inspect. We publish in the open. The entire process of getting an app included and updated is handled in the open. Anyone can watch us work, can participate as well. We're representing the user, and this means that we're also representing the user in terms of happens with the apps that we ship. So we don't just blindly ship apps as the developers ship them. First, we ask the developers, we try to educate them saying, are you sure you want to ship an app with tracking? In F-Droid, it will be flagged. And we see quite often that when it's made visible, the developer will choose to make it opt-in. And we'll see the same app in Google Play will have tracking on by default, and in F-Droid will have tracking off. The only force is us asking them and flagging it. And our reviewers don't have any monetary interest in the apps they're reviewing. So this is quite different than Apple and Google. So Apple and Google are taking a cut of the app. So when an app is making, like Fortnite, is making $100 million a year, then Apple or Google's reviewers are on the line. If they block this app for bad behavior, then Apple or Google would lose $30 million. If you follow the patterns of reviews, it turns out that big popular apps get more lenient reviews in those app stores.
Let's move to Google. Android has long allowed alternative stores, yet over 90% of downloads still go through Google Play. Even with perfect DMA compliance by Google, would it be enough to challenge such entrenched market power, in your opinion?
Yeah, great question. Like phone, which has for a long time, play rights and distribution of software for phone. Android has always free of other apps to be present. And those in various commercial app stores like Galaxy Store, the Epic Game Store, and things like that have been, strong for a while. Another example of that was the Amazon App Store is going for a number of years and actually wound up closing down in August of 2025, specifically statewide, but presumably it was not able. So I do think that it's a very good question, even with perfect compliance with Apple and Google. Is that sufficient to facilitate a thriving marketplace that we have seen some of these apps go? To be honest, I don't know. I personally am just on the sort of nonprofit, non-commercial side of questions about, is it possible to essentially jumpstart a competitive app marketplace? Necessarily my specific area of focus, but I do think it's a really good question. One of the things that I think is really important to think about is that there is room for alternative mechanisms for even, profit-seeking app store to thrive. Apple Store on iOS uses a Patreon model. Kind of an implicit subscription to the developer, a trusted developer for an individual application, not so much of the download an app or buy some little in-app purchases or advertise through advertisement and ad tech. So could you compete on a level playing field, both using the exact same models that the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store have? So could you compete using different models? And that's where I think it's really important to be able to facilitate this sort of experimentation, to be able to up the marketplace for competition so that the different, can try interesting, innovative, logical isms for trying to monetize their store.
Google has announced its developer verification program. Can you explain concretely why that creates perhaps even an existential threat to F-Droid?
This is known as Android developer verification. This is classic Google Play move in that it is based on a sound idea, like to reduce the amount of malware out there. It probably will help to some degree, but it just also happens to lock in Google's control over the Android ecosystem more. It turns out there's better ways of solving this problem, and these better ways will be locked out. So Android developer verification means that in order for an app to run on Android, no matter where it came from, whether it came from Google Play, whether it came from any other app store, including F-Droid, it has to be published by a developer that is registered with Google. And so right now they are saying, oh, we do this, it's just a check to make sure that your good actors that are publishing apps but it does give them the power to block all of that developer's apps on any Android device. And given Google's history of what they accept in Google Play, so in the beginning in Google Play, things like ad blockers were allowed, things like alternative clients for various websites were allowed, and various other things. And over time, Google has blocked these apps from Google Play, has kicked them out. They were relatively open, and then as they get the power, they can lock it down, and things that they don't like, they kick out. This would then give Google that power over any Android device, no matter where the source. They say that their program will be like, oh yeah, we'll have a student version, but it would still give them the power to lock out all your student account, your developer account, and you would have to go through Google. Right now, they're playing nice. They're saying it's in everyone's interest. Look, we're going to reduce malware. We're not going to do anything of this, even though you have to give real information about all the developers. So they'll have all this information about who the developers are. And then if they get this into place, they will gradually lock things down. So things that they don't like they will be able to say no more ad blockers on Android ever, no matter where you get it. They will have that power. And I would be surprised if they did not use that power that way, because their track record shows that they do. That gives Google the power to just say, we're tired of F-Droid, we'll just turn it off. And that is a sort of Damocles. Like, that's just a condition that makes it very hard to sustain a project if in a moment's notice it can just be turned off for millions of people. And it's not a power that one company should have, in my opinion. When we really get to the reason of why we have the Digital Markets Act.
With the DMA in the background, you launched the App Fair project. Could you briefly explain what the project is about and where you are with it today?
Yeah, the whole idea with the App Fair project is very much inspired by F on Android. So, with popular terms like Debian repository for Linux. And the general idea is that people can develop their own applications without necessarily needing to sign up with Apple or with Google, at least their source code, and then they submit it to the App Fair project. And the App Fair project essentially takes care of taking that source code and building it and then distributing it to alternative app marketplaces, both for iOS and for Android. The rollout is that it will, pack your iOS app and create a catalog for AltStore, which is the new alternative app marketplaces in the EU and in Japan for iOS. Similarly, it will distribute it as an independent F-Droid catalog, which can be included by F-Droid package. And right now is a sort of a app store. It takes care of all the complexity of taking your application, building it and getting it into the hands of as many people as possible through these alternative marketplaces. And then also if they satisfy the various inclusion criteria of the, first party app stores, the Apple App Store, the Google Play Store, it will also distribute them there. So you have as wide a possible relation base, and you can provide, free open source software without necessarily having to sign up with Apple and pay them money, or sign up with Google and pay them money, or agree to terms and conditions. You can just developers like to do, which is to create software that they want to use and they think the world will want to use. And the App Fair project handles all the complexity of, like getting that out into the hands of end users.
Before the DMA, running F-Droid meant basically trusting Google wouldn't pull the rug. Now there are rules. What protection does the DMA actually provide to you?
We got started because Google chose to compete by building an open ecosystem. Apple was already well ahead with a closed ecosystem, and I thought it was a good business decision. They competed on openness. For the first 10 years, that's how we operated, because Google Play needed to remain open to be considered an alternative to Apple iOS. That changed, though, as they became quite dominant, really the dominant force in mobile phones around the world. And the DMA came in good timing for us. From the beginning, Android, I think a key reason for its success is that it competed on openness. It competed against iOS, being the more open alternative. But now they don't have to. They have their ecosystem right now. Their strategies focused on the competition. law aspects and working very hard to defend monopoly profits. Before the DMA, any of these changes, we would have just had to accept and make the best of it. Now we can flag things. Actually, we're at the point where when we published on this Android developer verification saying we will not participate, we will not sign up, competition authorities actually reached out to us, which was for saying, okay, we think this might not be in compliance with this settlement, this law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a whole new level. And that, I think, it really started to happen with the attention from the DMA. When the DMA started, it didn't seem like any of the antitrust lawsuits were really going to go anywhere. But then with the Epic versus Google rulings, it seems to actually provide concrete gains in terms of opening up the market. Here is the Epic v. Google delivering things via just the existing lawsuits, the existing structures. And that seemed like it was going well, but now the new development is Epic and Google are doing business with each other. And suddenly they can just make a nice deal with each other, and then instead of having an improved openness in the market, Epic gets some wins and they get a nice business deal with Google. And that seems, to me, I can't resist the pun, an epic fail. And then, to me, this shows then the real strength of the approach of the DMA is that I feel like we have, in a much shorter time with much less effort, gotten concrete gains that aren't up to some companies deciding on whether it's their business sense or not, but comes from a democratic process. And from my point of view, I still feel that the DMA is the more promising avenue. These antitrust lawsuits go around the world, but we're also seeing countries around the world trying all sorts of regulations here. So it does seem that more and more people, more and more governments around the world feel like this is an effective avenue.
The Commission says Apple is frustrating alternative distribution channels and also direct app downloads. What does it realistically take to make Apple comply?
I mean, they are not complying in any way, shape, or form. People call it malicious compliance, but it's really just not compliance, complying with either the spirit or the letter of the Digital Markets Act. Mechanism by which Apple has gone about their claimed compliance is that they implemented something called alternative app marketplaces. And these are essentially just a extra redistributor for the existing store revision or review process. So if you were to want to, it's an application independently in one of the places where they permit it, which is in the European Union and then recently in Japan, likely to be, still in the near future, potentially South Korea and England and everyone else that has having this sort of regulatory scrutiny. You need to do is essentially do exactly the same thing as if you were distributing on the Apple App Store. You need to sign up with Apple, you need to pay them, a fee, and you need to agree to volumes of terms and conditions that are constantly changing. Of course, are non-negotiable to your application with their tools. You need to sign it with their certificates. You need to upload it to them. You need to wait for their app review, notarization, but it's really just a set of the normal App Store app review, and hope that it gets viewed. And then when all that is in place, essentially you then have the option to, in addition to potentially putting it on the Apple App Store, you can also specify an alternative app marketplace, something like Alt Store. And then in those cases, then Apple essentially packages up the application and encrypts it, impossible to, send or study, and bounces it over to the alternative app marketplace, which then is given the distribute it on their own terms. Over the past couple of years, compliance is just a game of delay, do something that is, compliant. They investigate, it takes months and months, and then they issue us on the wrist and a minuscule fine. It turns up into a political thing. And that's a few cycles of that already, and I don't really see that ever ending.
To me, from sitting in these gatekeeper workshops in Brussels, face-to-face with the people from Apple go reading their filings, working with people who have a deep understanding with iOS. Most of these concepts are very translatable from Android and iOS. My only impression is that Apple never really intended to comply from this experience. I've learned the term malicious compliance, and it captures it really well. Apple has lots and lots and lots of money, and it looks to me that I've seen very little good faith in this from them. And it looks like they're just going to spend money spinning everyone's wheels to maintain their monopoly profit margins.
To be an alternative app marketplace, you need to provide them with a €1 million letter of credit. A small independent non-commercial marketplace that might have all bespoke set of applications, pony up euros, obviously is a huge hurdle for the emerging competitors.
Things like a €1 million letter of credit for a non-profit free software app, following the same model that is proven by F-Droid, by Debbie, etc. We know this model works. They know this model works. They also rely on free software. Their infrastructure runs on free software as well. It is purely just to keep the competition out. This is total speculation, but I have the feeling that Apple is deliberately trying to get the third-party app stores are only the sketchy apps like adult content and gambling. And then they can say, look, DMA has failed because look at the app stores that are competing. Really, when you look at the terms, apps like the adult content and gambling can afford the €1 million letter of credit.
The Commission seems stuck with a familiar pattern. At this stage, what works better in your opinion? More fines, or the Commission saying, here is what effective compliance looks like. Here are the details. Stop being clever. So, in your opinion, what's going to work?
This seems to me a very new idea, that you would have a regulator able to direct how things are implemented. And I think it's definitely worth trying. I think it can definitely work. It's a question of resources. It doesn't seem to me the kind of thing that one person working at the European Commission could be like, oh yeah, we'll just do it like this way. So I think it's going to be a question of, in the law, it seems like we have enough, but what we need is like resources behind that in the European Commission to say, okay, let's make sure, especially this is like these first steps of trying this out. They need to be done as like the best possible cases and the best possible way. There's so many people looking for it to fail, and Google and Apple and probably a lot of the other gatekeepers from the DMA are really wanting it to fail. From the Android ecosystem perspective, Android is quite open, and because it's open source, we have a lot of developers who are not affiliated at all with Google, who really understand the platform deeply and care about it. We helped build it, really. The core of it was open source, and I have been involved in Android since 2008. And I know many people like me, and lots of us would love the opportunity to go in and show this is definitely possible. Here's how I could do a prototype of a lot of this. Or a lot of this stuff, because Android was built quite open, it's already there. So we can say it's not even a question of implementing this. It's more remove that thing you added. But getting that right, because of the amount of pressure, is tricky.
Just being able to come up with a set of rules, you must, comply to this. You must not be able to have centralized blocking of application distribution, particularly provide application programming interfaces for people to implement a fully competitive app store experience on their own. Like those would be a lot easier to lay out, and the rules and regulations that Brussels passes winds up being kind of the de facto template that other countries, adopting, have advantages and advantages. Disadvantages is that if a gatekeeper is able to get away with malicious compliance in the European Union, then that kind of locks in their strategy. Well, EU is permitting this, even if it's been established yet whether or not they will ultimately be permitting it, gotten away with it, for long enough, for 8 months or more, all of a sudden that becomes the de facto rule. So they just wind up applying the same system in Japan, in Brazil, probably in the United Kingdom.
We are barely at the start of DMA enforcement, yet already at the first review and public consultation. From your perspective, what is it that missing, apart from resources, and we have pointed to already, and the thing which is missing clearly needs fixing now or as soon as possible.
With a lot of these kind of restrictions, like the Android developer verification, even how Google runs Google Play, we focus so much on them because you have to really either get Android or iOS devices. That's the vast majority of what the market is. If you want to go buy a phone, you go to a store, that's what's available. But this is another example of where Google can do good design around security while keeping it open. If you look at the Google Pixel devices, you're able to unlock them and put your own operating system on them. So you can completely replace Android and put whatever you want on. And a lot of people are doing this, and we're all used to this with laptops. If I buy a laptop, it might come with Windows on it and put another operating system on it. Mobile phones are not different. They're just computers, like a laptop, like a PC. They're just small and battery powered. It's not possible to require that users are allowed to install an operating system on the phone that they bought. If we had this kind of same as a requirement under the DMA, then we wouldn't really have to worry so much about Google Play and Apple App Store, because we could easily provide a whole other operating systems where we control everything. And I think it would have a big impact on opening up mobile phone ecosystems, because then we can sidestep the whole question of Google Play restrictions and things like that. Like, we can make a device that does not have Android developer verification, or has if people like that developer verification, someone can set up their own program and have in a version of Android that with it. It would just open things up so much.
What would it take for public interest technologies to carry more weight in DMA enforcement?
I think what I've seen, especially people working on free and open source software, is that there's a lot of technologists who are interested in having their voice heard in these processes. They say, oh, this is interesting. There's public comment. I want to give my point of view. So I think the interest is definitely there. There's a few things that I think get in the way, and I'm trying to think what would be the biggest. I think especially when you're looking at free and open source software developers, they're already used to doing things because they believe it's the right thing, and they'll do it on their own time. So financing would definitely help things, but I don't know if that's the key blocker. These processes of public comment, or the way, so like a call on the European Commission's website, these gatekeeper workshops, things like this. It took me a while just to figure out how to navigate, to find these things. And then also, it seems to me there's clearly a structure that these public comment forums are expecting, but it seems quite difficult to figure out. It's not obvious. It feels like there's no how-to of how do I write public comment that will get the attention of the European Commission? I haven't found the simple how-to how do I set up a website for the first time? There's lots of those. And so that to me feels like a big blocker. Just now, I showed up at the first gatekeeper workshop because people who work in policy got my name and basically kept nagging me until they're like, you have to go to this thing. And I was like, I don't know what this is. You have to go. And then I went, and I was like, okay. It was also kind of guesswork. I was like, I guess I'm here to question. So I tried asking questions and figured it out. So I think that's one thing that could help, is just if there was organizations that were resourced to just go out, find people and coach them, mentor them in the process. Try and find the people who are interested, reach out into familiar terms to developers and help them find the places to get involved, and mentor them in how you have to structure the communications. On the flip side of that, I don't know how realistic this is, but the European Commission's website could just be a lot more familiar. It's kind of like entering an alternate universe. It's like the way things flow in the European Commission's website. It's clear there's patterns to it, but it's unfamiliar to me. It feels like a foreign process from the internet I use day to day.
The regulator should be reaching out more to, the independent technologists to read on things rather than waiting to be contacted. These, fairly narrow time windows of, in review periods, going through hoops of legalese. I think that having symposiums, conferences where people can get together and just kind of have an open forum where say, things would be much better if we could distribute free software on this platform with less friction. It'd be much better if we had more funding to be able to develop these homegrown technologies, ideally with free and open source software that anyone can see and anyone can review.
I hope more people can get involved because I think this is a fight worth fighting and a fight that can be won. But it's kind of scary to see the imbalance in terms of resources.